welcome to our presentation. We're going to talk about parish adult education and faith and science. I'm here with John Livingston. John Livingston is the Director of Evangelization and Adult Faith Formation at St. Peter Catholic Church in Kirkwood, Missouri. I say Missouri, some people say Missouri. It depends whether you're from the East Coast or from the West, but originally from Western Pennsylvania, John now lives in the St. Louis area with his wife, Holly. John is also a graduate student at the Aquinas Institute of Theology, where he is entering his final year of the MA program in theology. His research interests include theological anthropology, with the study of the human person, and of course, the relationship between theology and science. So welcome, John. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here with you, Chris.
Sure. Well, we're happy to have you. We can jump in. We might as well start with you're running a faith and science educational series right now at your parish, and certainly would like our listeners to know about that. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the summer series that we are running here at St. Peter. Summer tends to slow down in the parish, so this year we are trying the experiment of adopting the opposite approach. We're going to speed things up with adult faith formation. People just tend to be available in the evenings. So we had a series on Catholic social teaching. We've had a series on 5 different moments in history. And currently, we are in the middle of a series on faith and science. So there's 3 weeks to the series. The first one was last Thursday, July 10th, and I led that night. It was just sort of a general introduction to the relationship between faith and science. A lot of parishioners don't necessarily think of those two in terms of a relationship, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more. So it's just sort of an introduction to the question and the gravity of the question. This coming Thursday, so this would be July 17th, our pastor, Father Matthew O'Toole, will be leading the evening, and he'll look at the historical context of the Galileo trial. Father O'Toole is kind of a historical theologian in his education, so he will almost drop the needle on that moment in church history and talk about what led up to this trial, what actually happened, and in many ways, how it continues to affect the church today. Then our final week, this would be July 24th, Michael Anthony Abrill. He is a parishioner here at St. Peter, but he is also a professor of systematic theology at the Aquinas Institute. I studied theology and evolution with him. I took intro to theology with him. I just finished theological anthropology with him. So he is a fabulous teacher. And he will be discussing the field of evolutionary theology. He just published one of the first critical introductions to that field. So he'll be talking a little bit about his book, but really more translating it to the popular level, why we should be concerned, or not even concerned, but intrigued, excited by this emerging field of evolutionary theology.
That sounds really fascinating, and also very contemporary in terms of the kinds of questions that people have. Going to really the basics, what would you say? And you probably covered this in your initial talk for the session. What would you say to somebody who is trying to figure out exactly how faith and science really are complementary? A lot of what we hear today says that they're entirely separate and that we should treat them separately. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think you're right that the starting point for most people probably is that they are separate. And if they're not separate, they might be in conflict. So I think that really is the first step of just sort of acknowledging what presuppositions we're taking into the question of their relationship. And I found that a helpful tool for understanding that is the work of Ian Barber. So he is the great scientist theologian from the mid-20th century who many credit with creating the so-called bridge between science and contemporary theology, at least contemporary Protestant theology. Barber developed a fourfold typology of ways of relating science and religion. So conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration. So conflict would be, of course, the thesis that they conflict with each other. So biblical literalism and scientific materialism would be worldviews that fall under that category. That on the one hand, the earth was created in 6 days, 6,000 years ago, versus there was no divine action, just the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. Only one of those truth claims could exist. They necessarily exclude each other. I think most people, at least most Catholics, don't approach the question of faith and science that way. I think you were right to identify that most fall under the independence thesis, that they speak different languages. A phrase that I run into quite a bit is that science answers questions of how or when or even what, but theology answers questions of why or who. And while I think there might be a shred of truth to that, it can relegate scientific inquiry and theological inquiry into such divergent domains that they really don't have anything to say to each other. To kind of say to science, you take on the epistemic work, we'll do the ethical work, I think you're never going to really be able to bring those two in dialogue. You'll just end up back in conflict. So I think what I found helpful then is bringing people to an awareness of the possibility of those two other ways, that is dialogue and integration. Barber, I'll admit, is a little bit hazy on his definition of those two and how they're distinct, because ultimately what he's seeking is dialogical integration. So integration is almost the fruit of dialogue. But I think for me at the popular level in the parish, bringing people into an awareness of what questions we can be asking. So questions like, what would a scientifically informed approach to Genesis look like? Or what possibly could contemplation reveal beyond the veil of epistemic certainty? And kind of bringing people into an appreciation that science and theology do make truth claims within the same domain, and we either need to learn how to speak together or things are going to get really messy really fast.
Yeah, excellent. We might even go back a step and talk about, Barber talks about how science has changed in terms of its focus on, originally, a lot of Catholic philosophy or Christian philosophy was based on the four causes and Aristotelian causes. Whereas there's kind of a definition, whether that's true or not, that suggests that science only speaks about efficient causality and does not talk about. So can you talk a little bit about just what's the difference? What is science today? And when the church talks about it, it's often speaking with a very different history and different understanding of science in a broader sense.
Yeah, that's great. The fields of science and theology, it's almost difficult to talk about them from a historical perspective, because you're right to point out that those terms have changed so much over the centuries. Even in Aquinas's time, science and theology were essentially an integrated field. There was no separation between physics and metaphysics. Aquinas will talk about theology as the most certain science because it's based on the truth of God. And if theology then is the study of God and all creation in relation to God, science is just sort of a step below that. It's almost more an application of that relationship between God and creation and an examination of creation itself. So for the medievals, this very much an investigation into Aristotelian causalities. This is all part of the same conversation. It's really not until Newton and Galileo and the sort of flourishing of experimentation that we see a split. Barber describes it as a metaphysical chasm opening between the observer and the observed world, where we kind of start to investigate primarily cause and effect, which would fall under the category of efficient causality. I
Right.
think this is so ingrained in the way we even ask the question why nowadays that I'll admit, being a student at Aquinas, studying with these Dominican friars, it took me embarrassingly long to even learn what the other types of causality meant, because I could only wrap my head around the causality of efficient cause, an external agent acting upon something. Just the
Mhm.
anytime I even tried to define final causality, I just defined it in terms of its efficient causality. So
Mhm.
I think there's truth to the idea that science kind of took over that domain, but theology kept speaking the language of the other causes. But I think that is a little bit too neat of a separation. It's a little bit too simplistic. And of course, what Barber does is he says, we're really investigating quite a bit of this. And Barber pokes holes in the epistemic veracity of science's ability to even ascertain efficient causality. So he kind of shows that we're really much more methodologically parallel than we might think.
Right. Right. There's also there's a lot of characterization of science as being about fact. There's a lot of talk, particularly, and you see that in the popular media. They like that word fact as indicating something that is true versus something that maybe is not necessarily true or is based on religious faith or is based on emotion or interest. Um, what would you say to those? Stephen Jay Gould is an example who suggests that there's no connection between faith and fact, and that we should really keep, even though the two areas, faith and science, might be interested in a lot of the same topics, that we should really methodologically keep them separate.
Yeah, I think the first response I would have to someone who would say that is that all data is theory laden. I believe that is the work of Hansen, would be his name, who kind of said that there's no such thing as objective data. The observer has an influence on the data. Of course, in the quantum world, we know this as an ontological reality, that the observer does actually change the reality of what can be known. But I think when Barber steps into this conversation, he says that we don't even need to go that far. Being an observer, taking in data, you're necessarily going to interpret it. So, one of the more fascinating sections of Barber's text, Issues in Science and Religion, is where he really compares science to history and history to theology. And he uses history and the other social sciences as a sort of midpoint between the two to say that, there are events that happen, they are certain facts, but we interpret them, and that's how we come to know them. The same thing happens in science, the same thing happens in theology. He refers to it as a spectrum of personal involvement. So he sort of takes that and redefines objectivity, or what we might be here calling fact, and he says objectivity really just refers to the universal availability of this data. It's not a sort of dogmatic truth. We can never, even in science, come to objective fact. There's always going to be a subjective dimension. In theology, it's just a little bit more of that subjective dimension, but we would still claim that there is a reality beyond it that we're both attempting to seek through our models and metaphors.
Right. So we're not saying that there's no reality, that everything is purely subjective. We're saying that basically our access to it is still mediated.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
Barber uses the term critical realism. So that would
Uh-huh.
frame that there is objective reality, but it lies beyond our epistemic grasp. He contrasts that with instrumentalism, which would be that there really is no objective reality. It's just the best theory to describe it or manipulate it is the truest we could get to. He also contrasts it with naive realism, which would say there is objective reality and we have direct access. Now, there is kind of an open question, and in fact, my master's thesis is kind of tending in this direction of whether the Christian tradition is truly naively realistic or if there is a dimension of critical realism. In other words, can we really apprehend reality as it is, or is there a necessary filter? So I'm still in the research phase, so I don't want to say too much and have to revise my comments later.
That sounds very interesting. Um, Now, a lot of people would say that that really, in reality, though, that we still have to deal with facts, that we still have to deal with understanding the empirical world, and getting back to the difference between faith and science. Would you say, or what would you say to those who basically indicate that knowledge of facts needs to essentially trump what it is that we know about faith, or what we understand through faith?
Right. What I would hear in that really is not even a critique of theology. I think that might be a misunderstanding of the scientific method. I think back to when I learned about the scientific method in grade school. It was very much presented to me as you formulate a hypothesis, you test that hypothesis, you analyze the results, and you either confirm the hypothesis or you deny it. That's all well and good for a grade schooler. That does on some level capture what epistemic verification is. However, I think contemporary philosophy of science, it much more trends in the direction of there is no fact. There's what we do in science is we model reality. We come up with metaphors that describe reality. This is kind of the distinction between critical realism and naive realism, that science would say there always will be an ontological gap between what we can know and what is. So for someone who would say that science is the realm of fact and theology is the realm of faith, which is beyond fact or doesn't attain to fact, I think I would start by discussing what they mean by the nature of fact. And my hunch is on some level, we will have to wrestle with the idea that even science does not measure up to the level of objective reality that we would like it to be.
Excellent. Yeah, that's very helpful. Now, Saint John Paul, Pope Saint John Paul II, had said that science can purify religion from error and from superstition. But he also, and I think most of our contemporaries would agree with that. That fits in with a lot of the modern idea and even postmodern idea of reality. But John Paul followed that statement with religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. So in that case, what does he mean by idolatry there? What would he be talking about, and how faith might be able to actually reform science?
Yeah, I wonder if he's referring to the idolatry of scientism. So
Okay.
the belief that everything that is can be reduced to the scientific method, that the only possibilities are those possibilities which are logical possibilities or physical possibilities. And by physical possibilities, I mean according to the laws of physics. In many ways, that can become an idol because it closes creation off to its creator. And of course, that is going to come into serious conflict with a lot of core Christian beliefs. We believe that the resurrection happened. That is not an existential metaphor for Jesus having some sort of cathartic experience. We believe that he was dead and he is now alive. If we close off creation to any sort of divine activity, then we suddenly close ourselves off to God and we make creation itself the biggest thing, which would be the definition of idolatry.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's interesting that during the 20th century there were a lot of debates around positivism, which is basically kind of a predecessor to scientism in a more general sense, where positivism was focused on the idea that the only thing that's true is something that's a purely logical or empirically verifiable statement. And there was a lot of discussion and a lot of debate about it. But these days, you can see the idolatry has come into play in the sense that we don't even talk about positivism anymore. Most people don't even know what it is. And so from a theoretical standpoint, it's almost as if it's seeped into the common consciousness and culture without the critical discussion and debate that we had in past decades.
Yeah, it's almost like when we slew the dragon of positivism, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. Sorry to mix metaphors there, but it's almost as if we said, science, the scientific method cannot attain to objective reality the way we would like it, and then followed that up with, therefore, there must be no objective reality. And I think that's a problem. And when
Right.
we absolutize that claim, we make of not even reality, we make of our concept of reality, a sort of instrumental approach to reality. We make of that an idol. And I mean, as we know throughout the centuries, if we ever lose the connection between reality and God, things are not going to go well.
Right. Right. Do you, I'll follow that up with just kind of an interest of mine is particularly in how artificial intelligence and the entire sensibility around it is focused on a very instrumental, pragmatist idea of reality and of the way that we approach it. Would you see that as having an influence on the way that we think about science these days?
Oh, absolutely. Questions about artificial intelligence. Yeah, you're right. It's almost entirely instrumental. And I think what's scarier is it's instrumental at the service of commodification. How can we employ AI to more efficiently render a product? There's really not a conception of, is Grok telling the truth? It's almost as if that is an irrelevant question. It's just a matter of, is this particular AI causing a problem? Is it going to create issues later? Again, it's all efficient causality. What is the effect that this is going to have? I think it's just sort of, it's short-sighted ultimately. And I'm very intrigued in the contemporary discussions of training AIs on virtue-based ethics. The most current issue of Theology and Science is entirely dedicated to AI, and there are several articles of kind of taking the field of virtue ethics and marrying it to AI. And it's just a fascinating question of how we can even go about this.
It is. Personally, I wonder, we need to have a society that's oriented around virtue in the first place before we talk more about how we're going to incorporate that into artificial intelligence or anything else. I mean, virtue ethics is certainly the way to start. In regard to your own education, and the educational work you do with adults, how do you see us applying the faith science dialogue to evangelizing? Evangelizing both Catholic adults, but also those who might be interested in the faith and might have basically see a scientific or scientistic perspective as a block to being able to engage the faith more enthusiastically.
Yeah, what a great question. I think for me, where this whole question of the relationship of faith and science meets the world of evangelization, I think it's captured by wonder. This feeling of infinitude that is in each of our hearts, whether we're aware of it or not, this question. Karl Rahner starts his dissertation, now published, Spirit in the World, as, man questions. And he kind of says that humankind is essentially questioning incarnate. I think each of us deep down questions. These might be intellectual questions. They might be more existential questions. They might be more intrapersonal. I think the most fundamental question we all ask is, am I loved? But I think we question, and where faith and science comes into play, at least for me in my experience leading the OCIA process here at St. Peter, for example, is that oftentimes I think those who are new to faith or who want to grow deeper in their faith, they might feel as though they are hitting a ceiling of wonder, where suddenly maybe this whole religion thing is not going to be able to contain my questioning. Maybe I'm going to hit a ceiling, or to flip the metaphor, hit the bottom of the pool. And all of a sudden, I'm going to get to this sort of dogmatic certitude that will tell me, stop asking questions. This is the end of your inquiry. Either accept it or don't. For me, employing this question of the relationship between faith and science is about raising that ceiling, or showing that there is no bottom to the pool, that God can handle all of our questions, because look at the infinitude of science and the impossibility of containing all of objective reality. Now multiply that by infinity, because that's just creation. We haven't even begun to explore the creator who's beyond it. I think wonder is the key that unlocks the door to transcendence. And I think both the question of faith and science and evangelization are about walking through that door and realizing ultimately at its most basic that there is more to life than this.
That's excellent. How do you actually instill wonder in individuals? There's some sense, at least I feel, where there's a lack of wonder in a lot of our population, and maybe they're not the ones who necessarily attend the educational sessions because they're already subdued in that sense. But are there ways that we can instill that wonder, particularly through a faith science dialogue, but not, also more generally?
Mm-hmm. I think the most primary way is modeling it. And unfortunately, that's just sort of the answer with everything when it comes to evangelization, that it's embodying what we are trying to communicate. I think, funnily enough, of this scene from When Harry Met Sally. I think evangelization is when we are so on fire for God, or we are so filled with wonder at the infinitude of God, that people look at us and say, oh, I'll have what she's having. So I think that's the first. It's just modeling it. It's in each and every OCIA session or adult Bible study session, just communicating that spark, that excitement, that God is amazing and truly amazing. We tend to overuse that word, but God is awesome, truly, literally awesome. And when we communicate that, it gives people permission to wonder themselves. Beyond that, I think there are more explicit things we can do. I think introducing people to various questions and problems, kind of not necessarily putting questions in people's mouths, but creating a space where they can ask those questions. And sometimes that necessitates rattling the cage a little bit. When we introduce original sin, of course, we're going to use Genesis 3 to do so. We're going to talk about Adam and Eve and the fall, because it's just so rich in its symbolism and its imagery that it contains those mysteries and reveals them in symbol in a way that propositionalism will never really attain to. However, when we do that, it's also important to bring up certain questions of evolutionary theology, where we say, okay, I want you to hold on to this idea that sin is historical, that we made a free choice against God. And let's make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that it's unlikely that the human population was ever as low as 2. So how do we do this? And it's sort of it invites the question and the wondering. And if we are modeling mystery in the right way, it allows our inquirers or our adult learners or whomever to grab that question and allow that question to take them deeper rather than shut down their sort of spiritual searching before it even begins.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, I definitely have seen the difference in somebody who really is excited about and believes in the mystery, particularly that they're expressing, makes all the difference in the ability to accept it and to be interested in exploring it further. Because obviously, in an educational session, you're not going to cover everything. It's an opportunity to instill wonder and curiosity in individuals and get them to maybe ask more questions outside of the session or to explore things on their own.
Yeah, one of the things that we tell our sponsors, so the people who are accompanying the inquirers, the catechumens or candidates, we tell the sponsors that the phrase "I don't know" can be very powerful. Because when your inquirer asks you a question and says, how come this or why this, sometimes modeling mystery and just admitting, I don't know, it gives them permission to move forward, to continue to wonder, to allow those questions to be there. Because at the end of the day, our pursuit of God is not an intellectual pursuit. It is so much beyond that. So our intellect alone will not get us there. So kind of saying, I don't know, and I am still here. I am still on this journey. It can be remarkably powerful.
Yes. Yeah, it can also be scary in many ways, particularly for the educator, to encourage that wonder and encourage the questioning, particularly when when we're discussing articles of faith or we're discussing propositions related to faith, that we want to make sure that we don't make those errors and we don't lead somebody in the wrong direction, but we also really want to open up to those questions. We see that with I work with ITEST, Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, and we try to put on educational sessions that ask questions and open up different perspectives and ideas. But it's quite a balance, as an educator, to make sure that we open those questions, but we also don't encourage not necessarily questions, but maybe answers that are not maybe well founded.
Yeah, I would have to give a very big shout out to the team of catechists that helps with the OCIA ministry, because there are many of us in the room. Most of us have advanced degrees or are on our way to an advanced degree. So yeah, you're right. When those big questions come, and especially those questions that do have a right answer, we very much lean on each other of I can field this one. I could put this into a sentence. Because yeah, you're right. Questions are good. Bad answers are not so good.
Sure. And that's a very helpful practical suggestion or indication for those who are involved in adult education and also youth education. But that team effort, that ability to work with the catechists and to bring others into the process, so that you're not alone. You're not simply presenting information, but you're also working with individuals that can carry the educational effort forward and bring people into a fuller communion with their faith.
Yeah, it might be a cheesy line, but it's very true. Jesus never sent anyone out alone. It was always at least 2 by 2. So yeah, there is power in community.
Okay, excellent. I'd like to talk more about adult education in the faith in general, but I wanted to give you a chance. Can you tell us a little bit about you have a soon to be published article that's coming out. It's called "Through a Glass Darkly: referring to the Apostle Paul's quote, constructive dissonance in the science and theology dialogue. Can you tell us a little bit about your thesis in that publication?
Yeah, so the thesis is fairly simple, and it's that the science and theology dialogue is a dialogue characterized by what I'm terming constructive dissonance. So the first half of the article is really tracing where that term comes from, going from Barber to some of his followers, Ernan McMullen, Ted Peters, Robert John Russell, and tracing how the dialogue between science and theology proceeds. So many of those scholars, they develop terms such as consonance and dissonance. So what I'm doing, I'm just picking up on their work and looking at its sort of constructive dimension. So if this dialogue contains within it both consonance and dissonance, what's the function of this dissonance? So that's where I employ that image of Paul from his first letter to the Corinthians, that now we see through a glass darkly, but then we will see face to face. It's essentially, I'm using it as an image of there are things that we cannot know. There are mysteries. There are questions we have that might feel bigger than the answers we could even come to. That's dissonance. That is the is notness of the dialogue between science and theology. So what I do in the article is I propose 3 ways of looking through this glass. One way is to treat the glass like a lens, and we see through it to construct intersubjective explanations. So explanations that accord on some level with both a scientific and a theological explanation.
Mhm.
I discuss looking through the glass as a mirror, which reflects our own presuppositions. There are many examples of this throughout the history of science and theology. One that comes to mind is Herbert Spencer, using Darwin's theory of natural selection to defend the idea of survival of the fittest. I mean, this is something that we still very much see in libertarian politics. The issue is Herbert Spencer had coined the term survival of the fittest many years before Darwin ever published anything on natural selection. So he was not really in dialogue with this scientific theory. He was just laundering his own presupposition through it. So one of the functions of dissonance in this dialogue is to show us these areas that we ought to see, these kind of whoopsies that we should encounter and not just sort of set aside, because what we're really reflecting is ourselves in those moments. Then the third way we look through this glass is as if it is a prism. So this is where we come across these points of friction in the dialogue that are not necessarily presuppositions, but they are points that resist intersubjective explanation in some way. So an example of this could be the use of contemplation as a method. A scientist who prays and receives an insight through prayer, that's certainly not an epistemically verifiable insight, but it can propel her inquiry into whatever it is that they're trying to solve. It's a point of friction that resists explanation, but is not just this mere unchecked presupposition. When we encounter those points of friction, it can lead to the emergence of entirely new paradigms, as if we are looking through a prism and seeing a rainbow emerge. So the article really is just an analysis of various moments or inquiries or theologians or scientists that have employed these techniques, and I'm sort of slapping terminology on it to create a heuristic that might be usable as we consider how this dialogue progresses.
Okay, thank you. That's for one, a very succinct description of a complex article. I did get a chance to read through it, and but it also I think it's very helpful to those who look at particularly those who look at the integration of faith and science in a positive way, and see it as a great possibility, but also often look at it in terms of almost a mood, as almost a way of thinking and a way of approaching, but not necessarily in a more methodological sense, where we can really get down to brass tacks and look at ways to integrate the two. But also in terms of our understanding of reality, that we don't have to give up on our understanding of a single reality and a single truth, simply because these two approaches to reality have very divergent, sometimes methodologies, but also very much in divergent perspectives on what we look for in reality.
Yeah, I like the way you phrase that. I had a teacher who once told me that when you're reading someone or reading an article, a very helpful hermeneutical question to ask is, what is this author afraid of? And that sometimes unlocks the thesis on a level that might even go deeper beyond what they state the thesis is. So if you were to ask that of my paper, my research, what am I afraid of? I think the way you phrased it just captures it. What I am afraid of is that we might give up on this dialogue because the dissonance is just too much to bear. And I think what I am seeking to demonstrate is that this dialogue does not proceed in spite of dissonance. It actually proceeds through this dissonance. So as we will continue to encounter more and more dissonance as science continues to progress, the Galileo affair is not the last time that science and theology are going to come head to head. We know this with artificial intelligence. We know this with questions of war nowadays. We do not need to fear these dissonances, and we most certainly do not need to give up in seeking the reality that lies beyond them.
Yeah. And there's also very much a critical element to it too, in the sense that we can use that dissonance and understand it as an impetus to looking at the methodologies or the approaches that we take in theology just as much as in science, and look at them critically and actually, I think this was the lens portion of your heuristic, that we need to look carefully at what it is that we're doing, and not simply accept it as being, this is the way theologians do it, this is the way scientists do it. Everything's, we should use the dissonance as an opportunity to look carefully and also improve the way that we go about our methodologies.
Yeah, I use Paul Ricoeur's phrase, a hermeneutic of suspicion. And I think a hermeneutic of suspicion is best deployed when it's turned inward. So
Right.
when we use this dissonance to question ourselves and refine what we are trying to say, I think going back to John Paul II's quote, that is how science purifies faith. It allows us to question what it is we believe so that we can more properly believe what we are trying to articulate.
Okay, excellent. I'd like to get back to just talking about faith education, particularly adult education, because at least in my experience, the parishes that I've been associated with have been very focused heavily on youth education, which is, there's a big concern about the youth being brought up in the faith properly and having that opportunity to be really engaged. But there's also very often a lack of opportunities for adults to engage. Certainly opportunities in service, but not necessarily in terms of education and expanding our wonder, as you expressed it. I found there's a document it's back from 1999, but I think it's still considered the current document from the USCCB, the Catholic U.S. Catholic bishops. But where they basically, it was called "Our Hearts Were Burning Within Us: A Pastoral Plan for Adult Faith Formation in the United States." And there wasn't a whole lot in it that was all that surprising, but there was a statement that caught my eye. In Section 78, they said the principle is to give adult faith formation the best of our pastoral resources and energies, which really struck me that they would be indicating that. And it says within the whole scope of catechetical ministry, adult catechesis must be regarded as a preferential option in planning and programming. When adult catechesis excels, it can then serve effectively as the point of reference and organizing principle for all catechesis. So what do you make of this? Do you feel that not getting into the politics of parish ministry and that sort of thing, but do you think the parishes have gotten that message, and that there is an emphasis on adult education?
I would say they have received the message for sure, but I think I'll even admit here at St. Peter, and I say this as someone with adult faith formation in my job title, I do not think that we live that out as well as we could. And there's many reasons for it. Among them is just the busyness of adults, that you cannot have an adult event during the day and expect working people to show up to it. And adults who have children, really, there's no time in the week. I have been trying for 10 years now in parish life to identify the magic time when young parents can show up to an event, and it doesn't exist. They're exhausted, they're stretched, they're busy. It really, really is a difficult moving target. I think beyond that, which is in itself enough of a hurdle to explain why we don't offer nearly enough, I think beyond that, there's perhaps a mentality that learning is for youth, that youth is the time of our lives when we learn and expand our mind. And once we're done with college, we don't have to read ever again. I mean, statistics show that the number of people who have read a book since high school it's actually scarily low. And that's I'm not judging anyone. Again, it often comes down to time, and there are much bigger factors at play here. But the problem is, I think there might be an implied understanding that, well, I've been confirmed, I've gone through Catholic school or PSR or CCD, whatever you want to call it. I'm done. I've graduated. I sort of have my Catholic credentials. I don't think it's necessarily the idea of what do I have to learn? I know it all. I think it's just more, it's not necessarily relevant enough for me to reprioritize my schedule. So those two factors, I think, combine, and someone in my position, and I'll admit someone in my position is rare. Usually parishes are very, very understaffed, and someone responsible for the OCIA process and all adult faith formation often is also responsible for youth formation, youth ministry, communications. So even if you had the luxury of being in my position, there's where we seem to be stuck is that there's not necessarily a hunger for this formation. So it's hard to justify that sort of preferential option in programming, because yes, Jesus said where 2 or 3 are gathered, he is there. But sometimes that's hard justifying the amount of resources it would take to even get that 2 or 3, if that makes sense.
No, that's very interesting. I think helpful for other parishes and those who might be listening in is that there's we can be concerned about the supply of adult education and be concerned that there's not enough opportunities, but it may also be really the demand that needs some work, and maybe looking at new ways to reach adults and to generate that demand, generate that wonder or that yearning for answers to questions, and remind people that there are many questions out there that they certainly have not experienced or had answered, and even those who spend their lives trying to answer these questions, the scientists and the theologians, are not settled on the answers. So, do you have any ideas as far as how we might be able to reach out more to generate that interest or that demand?
A very simple principle, which is nearly impossible to put into place, is just everything that a parish does needs to be high quality. I think we need to value people's time and know that if they are spending their time setting foot on the campus, doing this or that, we owe it to them to do it well, to make sure what we're teaching is excellent quality, to make sure there is a radical hospitality. I make the joke all the time that I want our OCIA process to win a Michelin star. Just the silliness of just it matters that someone is here, and to respect and honor that they are here. It's almost a matter of justice. But beyond that, I think we take the approach of trying to be consistent in our messaging about what it even means to be a disciple, what it means to be an adult in the faith. We can often reduce that to the sacramental bare minimum of going to Mass every Sunday, receiving the Eucharist, technically once a year, going to confession at least once a year. We can reduce the practice of our faith to a bare minimum. But here at St. Peter, we have been using a framework based on Jesus's command to love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. He's quoting this Shema prayer, but what we've done is we've taken that and said heart, soul, mind, strength represent the 4 dimensions of discipleship. The heart dimension is the community dimension, the dimension of building relationships, being with people. It's kind of the social side of being a part of a community. The soul dimension is the prayer dimension, coming face to face with God, expressing our relationship with God through worship. We could even include the sacraments in some ways in the prayer dimension, the soul dimension. Then the mind dimension, this is the one we're talking about, that we try to make it clear to people that the mind dimension is a part of faith, of using our intellect to grow in our understanding of who God is, to learn, to realize that we don't have all the answers. There are plenty of smart people who are always asking these questions, and we can join in that conversation. And then, of course, the strength dimension is putting our faith into practice by serving others, by using our strength, by using our time, talents, and treasures to reach out, especially toward those who are most marginalized. So that's sort of the long-term play of how we do this to sort of generate demand by simply starting with the idea that I don't want to use the word expectation, but it's at least an invitation to grow in your mind dimension. And then beyond that, to create relevant, exciting engagement opportunities that people really want to come back to.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I think there's a temptation in many ways and particularly in terms of providing the supply of education, is to turn to a lot of technological opportunities, and certainly that's very important, and it gives people an opportunity to learn in their own environment, at home, and in ways that they're familiar with. But it also, it misses that community element, misses that in-person opportunity to ask questions and to experience, as you said, experience the energy and the interest and the wonder of the person that's sharing those mysteries and that information with them. But it also, I think there's many ways that being around peers, being around those who are going through that same process and that same questioning and same path of understanding can really help somebody to not only just in terms of generating community and being around others, but also help them to maybe gain some motivation in that process.
Yeah, I like to point out to people that when you read the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, I think we Catholics tend to get very excited because, it's of course a foreshadowing of the Eucharist, that we tend to miss a detail, and it's that when Jesus begins this miracle, he first gathers people into groups. And I love pointing that out to people, that if you look at Jesus's mission on earth, I really think it could be captured by the word gather. He was always gathering people into groups. I think that's the function of a parish. Because you're right, we are in a golden age of content. There's interviews like this that will be shared with people who obviously can't be sitting in the room with you and me right now. Heck, we're not even in the same time zone. There's a beautiful way to apply technology and to share it with people. But I think the function of a parish, of that particular expression of the church, really is to gather people, to create peers, to create these networks where we are questioning, we are wondering, we are praying together as the body of Christ.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you very much. This is you're very eloquent and very helpful and have some wonderful insight into all of this. And I hope that you have an opportunity to continue to share your insight and your experiences with adult education and with not only with science and faith, but also with the overall experience.
Thank you.
We need to close, but did you have anything else that you'd like to say before we head off?
I would like to invite anyone who is in the St. Louis area, if you would like to join us for the remainder of our Faith and Science series. The remaining 2 weeks are Thursday, July 17th and Thursday, July 24th at 7 p.m. You can find more info on our website, stpeterkirkwood.org. That's stpeterkirkwood.org. But it's completely free. All are welcome. Just show up, and I'll be the guy with the name tag that says John.
That's great. I hope you have an opportunity to meet many of your parishioners and local residents. Well, thank you very much. It was great talking to you, and everyone. I hope you have a great day.